All right, thanks so much for coming, everybody. Welcome to Trajectory Labs. If it is your first time here, this is a little bit about us. We're a nonprofit based here in Toronto, aiming to facilitate the people of Toronto's contribution to the biggest challenges coming our way in AI. If you need to go to the washroom, right outside the glass doors, and there's a pin to the right of the doors if you need to get back in. Let's get into today's talk. We're really excited to have Ben Bucknall with us, who will maybe introduce himself and tell a bit about his background, talking to us about technical governance. Ben's okay with questions during the presentation. If you have like quick clarifying questions, I will ask that if you have like ideas about a vaguely related concept and want to share with the group, probably best not to do during the presentation, save those for the end. But if you do clarifying questions or like things like that throughout the presentation, feel free to shoot up your hand, and myself or Georgia will bring you a mic. This is being streamed to YouTube, so if you do have a question and we give you the mic, your voice may be on the YouTube video. So if that's a problem for you, then maybe get the person next to you ask the question or something. But yeah, without further ado, big round of applause for Ben, and let's get going.
Hey, thank you. I need to make sure I'm standing in the right place. Someone can shout at me if I'm not, or if you can't hear me. And I need to work this out. Oh, I guess like a clarification I'll give, or just like an amendment to what Mario just said, is that like this talk is essentially in three parts: motivations, open problems, and a little bit at the end on like advice for people wanting to get into the field. And like maybe if you do have like higher level observations that you want to give, we can do a little bit of that like at the end of each section, if that sounds good. I also realize I've got like a bunch of notes here that maybe I won't even look at or see, but that's fine. Cool, a little bit about me, just so that you guys have some background. Okay, cool. So I'm currently a DPhil student in engineering at Oxford. DPhil is essentially just Oxford's way of saying PhD because they have to be different. Soon to be visiting at Stanford for this fall semester, which is quite exciting. I'm also an affiliate at the Oxford Martin AI Governance Initiative and used to work at UKAC and Centre for the Governance of AI, among other places. I guess my background is like more on the technical side of things. I did maths and then computational science. But since about 2022-ish, have been focusing more on the governance and policy side of things, and trying to carve out this space of technical governance, which is kind of trying to join the two together, do some work in the intersection. And that's essentially the topic of this talk. Oh, I've lost the clicker again. Oh, there we go. Nice. So as I said, it's in three parts, all centered around technical AI governance. I'll first give some motivations, both for why I think AI governance more generally is important, but then also why I think this kind of technical research and analysis is at the moment just super important for advancing AI governance. I'll talk about some open problems in the field based on a paper I put out last year, which essentially tries to lay out and taxonomize the space of open problems in technical AI governance. And then finally, and this is a bit of like new content, I've given variations of this talk a few times before, and at the end of this one, I've decided I'll give a bit of just sort of a laundry list of like advice for people that might be interested in getting into this field. Yeah, a few comments. This is all my personal perspective on things, especially when it comes to like policy and governance stuff, but also in like the technical safety side of things. People can have very different opinions, and I don't want to give the impression that like anything that I'm saying here is super objective or like the true facts about anything. It's a very large topic, only scratching the surface in this talk. And yeah, feel free to like interrupt at any time with questions. I will try and make this accessible to as many people as possible. But actually, maybe I can just maybe get a show of hands in the audience of like what people's backgrounds are. Like how many people would say they're like somewhat technical or have knowledge in like a STEM subject? Okay, nice. And how many people have like some expertise or knowledge of like governance and policy, maybe relating to AI? Cool, nice. That is good for me because I largely thought about this talk for a technical audience with maybe less context on the governance side of things. Okay, I feel like I just rambled for like a long time there, so let's actually get into it. So first part of the talk, motivations. Why do I think this area in between governance and technical AI research is super important? So firstly, AI governance. You hear it said a lot, but AI can promise a lot of great benefits in a lot of different areas. So, you know, science, education, you hear a lot of talk of like, you know, especially in the UK at the moment, of AI being used to like power the economy, turbocharge the economy and economic growth and that sort of thing. Even in the last few days, we've seen a massive deal reached between like the US and the UK and a bunch of like tech providers and like Google, OpenAI, NVIDIA, that sort of thing. Based on the belief that like doing so and advancing AI will provide, you know, massive benefits to not just the UK, but other people as well, hopefully. But at the same time, it can also pose serious challenges. You have like harmful applications and use cases. So, you know, concerns around surveillance, lethal autonomous weapons, harms from use in like, oh, that says non-sensitive domains. I hope I meant sensitive domains there. Stuff like copyright infringement. You have more sort of like systemic effects. So stuff here is like concentration of power, effects on like the labor market and unemployment is one that you hear about a lot. And potentially even up to like catastrophic harm around, you know, you hear loss of control thrown about. Gradual disempowerment is a new one that people talk about, where we slowly hand off like decision-making power to AI systems voluntarily because it improves efficiency and that sort of thing. And eventually we're in a position where like all the decisions that are relevant are made by AI systems that we essentially don't have oversight of. So that's more sort of like future-looking stuff. And so the question that I would want to think about here is like, what is needed to address these like risks and realize the benefits? And this sort of gets to like the core of why I think AI governance is important, which is that if you just focus on like building better or safer, whatever that means, or more ethical, whatever that means, AI systems, will that achieve like the benefits that we want, but also mitigate these risks? And I guess this just brings me to my first core claim of the presentation, which is like those sorts of technical solutions around, you know, safety, alignment, machine bias, that sort of thing. In isolation, they're insufficient for ensuring AI is net beneficial for society. Governance is also needed. And I think, you know, the best example of this in my mind is like labor market stuff, where it's like safer systems may incentivize more people to use AI systems for work, which only increases the potential risk of like massive effects on the labor market at this sort of like diffuse systemic level. So I hope everyone's followed along with this core claim. And I see a question in the audience, if we can get a mic out there. Oh. Oh. I can repeat it if needed.
Hello, test. Yeah. Could you just quickly define what do you mean by governance in that case instead of the...
Yes, I can.
Thanks.
So what even is AI governance? This is the definition I've kind of elected to use. You'll see a lot of different ones out there. So it is the processes and structures through which decisions related to AI are made, implemented, and enforced, encompassing rules, norms, institutions, and a bunch of other stuff. So, you know, there's a lot there, and this, like, obviously, you know, finds its way into a bunch of different like areas of work or research. You know, you can get into like political science or like public policy or like business administration or economics. And so it's a very large field. I guess like what I tend to think about most of the time is on the policy side of things, especially thinking about like what governments should be doing about AI. And so I guess like for the remainder of this talk, I'll maybe be using those two terms interchangeably, so governance and policy. Though I do think that like governance most of the time is somewhat broader and includes, yeah, like business decisions, that sort of thing. Cool. And that kind of brings me to my second core claim, which essentially after this slide, I'll go on and try and convince you of, which is good AI governance, again, whatever that means, depends on input from technical research, analysis, and expertise. So essentially, the first key claim is that like technical stuff isn't sufficient, but also it's still necessary, right? If you're gonna be able to like know what decisions to make and how to make them, you need to have some understanding of what the technology actually is. So that's essentially what I'm gonna expand on in the next few slides. And this is based on a paper I put out a while ago. I realized that the title of that maybe isn't super clear on this screen. So the title is Position, Technical Research and Talent is Needed for Effective AI Governance, which I guess is another way of just stating the claim that I just made. You can find a QR code there if you want to read it. And so in this paper, we divide up into like two camps what we think is needed. The first one being technical research and tools. So this is like R&D in like computer science and AI, which is targeted at like enabling AI governance and policy. And the second bucket that we sort of pick out is more technical expertise and talent within sort of like governance and policy processes. So we need some sort of like closer collaboration between technical research and policymakers to ensure that like governance actions are like well-informed and make sense when you actually think about it in the context of like the technical reality of what AI is. And so, yeah, essentially in making this argument, we observe that a lot is happening in AI policy. I've just put like a bunch of examples here. I spent the afternoon updating this because the last time I gave this talk was a while ago, and you know, in the vein of the title of this slide, a lot is happening, so I had to try and squash a bunch more things in. So we have the AI Act, which if you were here on Tuesday, you would have heard about. We have like the Bletchley Declaration and the Frontier AI Safety Commitments, and the AI Safety Report as well, which are all based around the Summit Series, which is ongoing. The next one of which will be in India, if I remember correctly, next year. We have the recently released AI Action Plan in the US. We have the Codes of Practice. And then at the bottom there, we have a pending state legislation in California, essentially like mandating transparency requirements around frontier model development. And in the next few slides, I'll give a few examples, but again, we make the claim that like implementing a lot of this stuff, it's all like thinking about it in the abstract, but actually going in and implementing it will mean that you have to make a bunch more decisions which depend on the technology. So just looking at a few examples here, this is Article 55 in the EU's AI Act, which says, providers of general purpose AI models with systemic risk shall perform model evaluation in accordance with standardized protocols and tools. They'll keep track of, document, and report without undue delay like the outcomes and procedures of these methodologies to the AI office. But then if you think about this, it just brings up like a whole bunch more questions, right? It's like, what are like standardized protocols? Do they exist yet? If not, what should they be? How do we know that our evaluations are like thorough and actually like measuring what we think they are? There's an issue around data contamination, which is essentially where the evaluations end up in the training data of the models, just through like data leakage. Like if you publish a benchmark on the website, because that's where a lot of the training data for language models comes from, that could end up in the training data. And then it's just like kind of spoils the evaluation because you're not really measuring anything. You're just measuring the fact that it was in the training data. And you know, a bunch of other questions here where it's like, what information about the testing should be disclosed? What do policymakers need to know about? All these sorts of things. As a second example, which I'll maybe go a bit more into, this is from the executive order that Biden signed back in 2023, I think, which was later repealed by Trump. And it says the secretary shall require compliance with these reporting requirements that it says elsewhere in the document for any model that was trained using a quantity of computing power greater than 10 to the 26 floating point operations. So that's essentially the basic like computations that the hardware chips are doing during the training of the model. And despite this executive order being a bit out of date, this kind of thing appears all over the place. It's in the pending California bill that I talked about. It's in the AI Act. It's in the, is it in the Codes of Practice? I guess that's taken care of in the AI Act anyway. But when you start thinking about this, and this is one of the areas that has received a lot of scrutiny anyway, I'll just go through these and then we can take a question. You know, what is this trying to do? It's saying that like any model trained on a larger amount of compute than this is like in scope for the requirements. But like, why should that matter? I guess the motivation usually given is that it's like the larger models are in some way more risky, so we need to like put more requirements on them to try and manage that risk. But like, are compute thresholds even a good proxy for risk? You know, what are some alternatives that could also be a proxy for that risk or what you care about? How do we even measure this training compute, right? Like what sort of stuff should be included or not? Should cleaning of training data be included, or is it just once it's, you know, being used in the training process that should be counted? Do you still have a question?
Just a quick one. Where were these 10 to the power of 26 first mentioned? Was it this report? No.
I think it was definitely before this executive order. I see Anson in the back there. I'm wondering if he knows where it was like first mentioned.
First mentioned?
Yeah. Where do compute thresholds come from?
I think probably the AI Act, or it's somewhere like, my understanding is that there were some discussions. People looked around and saw that, GPT-4 was trained with around 10 to the 25 flop. And so probably a couple months after that, then people thought, okay, this seems like a reasonable threshold. Let's try to base it off of that. So it's probably within a few months after GPT-4.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess it's the kind of thing where it's hard to track down. But I think like, you know, one way of like reading what's going on here is that like, this is just trying to pick out the largest models, right? And so maybe the only motivation for that specific number is that it picks out a sort of manageable number of models that you would be able to like enforce your regulation upon. I don't know if that's like the actual motivation within like Biden's office, but like, yeah. And so it's kind of interesting seeing how this is like been developed over time. I guess there's like maybe a 2-year difference between these pieces of text here, to emphasize like, you know, how over time we've sort of got more detail around some of these questions, but there's still questions remaining. So this is from the sort of pending SB 53 in California at the moment. So you see there's also the 10 to 26 here. And then they have this second paragraph where they say the quantity of computing power described in the above subclause includes the original training run and any subsequent fine-tuning, reinforcement learning, or modifications on top of a model. So it's giving a bit more detail about how you count these computations, but you know, there's still a bunch of questions here. My question earlier about like whether compute used in like cleaning training data is included or not. Maybe another one is like if you do what's called de-risking runs, where you train like smaller versions of models with the same sort of like hyperparameters, the same sort of setup for the training process, but you don't use that end product. That's just sort of like for you to get a feel of like how the larger training run will go. Should you include compute spent on those or not, given that they don't end up in the final model? But they're still part of the development process, right? And final point on this is just like, yeah, this is one of the areas where a bunch of work has been taking place. So Epoch AI put out something on this the other day, which I believe Anson, you're an author on. So you should definitely go check that out, which kind of like, you know, there's this nice figure here where it's like training a massive AI model is a complex pipeline. And it just raises like, every one of the arrows on this diagram is like a question mark of like, should the compute in this part of the training process be counted or not? Yeah. And then we have a good paper up here, which you should also check out if you're interested, by Stephen Casper, which aims to like put forward one way of like answering these questions. Cool. Again, I realize I'm probably rambling quite a bit. So that was just meant to be like a small example on the kinds of topics that I think, you know, technical research is really important for. Maybe just a few words on like potential like counterpoints to this core claim that I'm making of technical research being important for governance. I guess one thing I want to point out is that like, I'm really not advocating for some sort of like techno-solutionism here. So I'm not saying that like, oh, all these governance and policy problems and decisions that need to be made can just be solved by like having better technology. I think like, you know, the claim that I'm making is that the two things need to be like working together and like talking to each other. Not that either one is like more important than the other and can solve the other's problems. There's also just a practical issue of like regulatory capture, where a lot of the technical expertise is in the companies that are developing these models and would be in scope for many of the pieces of regulation that are being put forward. And so if you end up relying on that expertise, then maybe, you know, some of the suggestions or answers or like, you know, information that you'd get from those people will be either intentionally or not biased in favor of the companies that are, you know, being regulated here. And if you don't depend on people at those companies, then the pool of people that you can rely on is going to be much smaller. This is something that the EU is really coming up against at the moment, with having trouble hiring people that are both, you know, EU citizens, don't have any any connection to like private firms or big tech, but do have like relevant expertise. Okay, that was the first part of the talk. I have no idea what time I'm on. Maybe I'll need to speed up. Oh, okay, cool. Do we have any observations or questions at this point? Cool. In that case, I'll take a sip of water and continue. Okay, so second part of the talk is essentially, hopefully I've convinced you that like this is an area that people should work on. So now the next question is like, okay, but what exactly should people work on? So this is essentially based on a big paper I put out last year called Open Problems in Technical AI Governance. You can find the QR code here. And essentially this was just trying to survey this space, categorize and taxonomize the questions within it and the different like sub areas that people might want to work on. So I'll essentially, just give a quick overview here, but I won't be going through the whole thing. You can take a look if you're interested. So in the paper, I realized maybe this is a bit late in the talk to give a definition of technical AI governance. But anyway, we define it as technical analysis and tools for supporting the effective governance of AI. And we outline essentially 3 different functions that we think work in technical AI governance could perform. So the first one is identifying the need for governance action. So essentially this is like, you can think of surveying the landscape of the AI industry and what's going on in research and development at the moment, and having almost an early warning of like, okay, we're seeing a problem emerge here that might require some like policy action to address. And then once you've identified a problem, you need to know what to do about it. And there'll be many different like actions that you can take as a policymaker to address this problem that you've identified. And a lot of the time, how you decide to act on that and what you decide to do to try and alleviate that problem is going to depend on key technical details. So, going back to the compute threshold example, you have a choice of like how to classify systems that are in scope of your regulation, and maybe you're thinking about compute thresholds versus something else, and the efficacy of those different approaches will really depend, as we've seen, on like different details about how specifically you implement that approach. So like what different parts of the development process are like in scope for counting compute. And finally, the third function is enhancing the implementation of governance actions. So this is, once you've decided how you want to approach solving a problem as a policymaker, again, thinking from that perspective, can you actually do it? Do you have the technical means to incentivize compliance, enforce it, capture non-compliance? As a firm, do you have the technical means to even comply in the first place, right? Like a while ago, there was a lot of talk about watermarking of generative AI outputs in policymaker circles as a way of identifying deep fakes and that sort of thing. But then you look at the like technical literature on this sort of thing and see that essentially all the approaches don't work. But at the same time, policymakers were writing into legislation that you need to have a robust watermarking method in your model, and so that there's a disconnect there where essentially we see technical AI governance playing a role in making sure that the things that policymakers are asking for are actually like doable. And so in the paper we lay out a taxonomy according to like 2 dimensions. So the first dimension is what we call targets, and this covers essentially parts of the like AI development pipeline. So we have data, compute, models and algorithms, and then finally deployment. And on the other dimension, we have what we call capacities. So these are essentially things that, as a policymaker, you would like want to do or want to be applied to the targets. This will make a bit more sense on the next slide. But so we have assessment. So you may want to assess data or compute. You may want to access it or verify or secure it. And then these 2 categories at the bottom are kind of cross-cutting. So operationalization is essentially translating like high-level guidance into like low-level protocols that can be followed at the technical level. And then finally, what we call ecosystem monitoring. So this is, essentially surveying the landscape, keeping abreast of like trends in the industry and that sort of thing. And so you put that all together and, wow, yeah, you can't read that. I guess you'll just have to scan the QR code at the end and go and look at the paper. But I do have some examples on the side here. So you can see along the top, you have the 4 targets I talked about, and then the capacities alongside. So for example, in assessment and models and algorithms, we have stuff like benchmarking, red teaming, model evaluation. I mentioned earlier how sometimes evaluation data can, sorry, I'm standing in the wrong place, can end up in the training data. And so we have preserving the integrity of evaluation data. This is an interesting one. So verification and data. So in this box here, we have stuff like, can you verify that a given model was trained on a given data set? So this could be useful, for example, if you're concerned about inappropriate imagery or pornographic imagery or that sort of thing being contained in a model's training data, then you could trust a developer to say like, oh yeah, we didn't have any of that stuff in our training set, and maybe they can even like show you the training set that they're claiming they trained on. But how do you know that that was the training set that they actually used when developing their model, right? And this is like a fairly interesting technical problem. Verifying audit results. I spoke about watermarking as well. And then, yeah, assessing and quantifying broad trends in AI development. So those are just like a few examples. I guess it's, yeah, let's take a question. Yeah. So this is one thing that people have suggested a bunch is doing third-party audits of systems or models, so essentially third-party evaluations. And I guess it can also apply in like internal case, but essentially you again, similar to like verifying training data, it's like you could trust what the company is telling you about the results of an evaluation they run. But ideally, you would want to verify that they're telling the truth about it, right? So they could say that their model scored like 84% on such and such benchmark. Maybe that benchmark isn't publicly available. Maybe it's like only the lab has it for their own use. Are you just going to like trust them, or, you know, ideally you'd have a way of like verifying that claim that they're making about that result? Any other questions at this point? Maybe I'm going too fast now through these examples. Yes, one over here.
All right, thanks. I'm trying to think about what are the objectives. Like you're doing all these things, but have you outlined the clear objectives of what we're trying to accomplish? I'm not sure if you showed it. I may have missed it. But.
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess my answer is that like what we tried to do in the paper is not have sort of like higher level objectives with regards to like what we think policy should be doing. What we're trying to do in this paper is outline areas of work that are technical in nature that for a variety of policy objectives would be broadly useful. Does that kind of answer your question? I guess like some of the policy objectives you could have are just like that maybe you want developers to take certain procedural steps during a development process that you think might improve the overall safety of the resulting system. Maybe you don't want developers making a system of a certain type at all. Maybe you'd want to put like a ban on a certain type of systems. That's pretty, you know, towards the more extreme end of things. And so these are a bunch of like different objectives that you might want that, you know, we think can be like facilitated by work in these areas. Cool, thanks. Nice. So that was actually the end of the middle part. I kind of went through it too fast because I realized, yeah, in earlier versions of this talk, I just like kept talking about all the list of open problems in the paper and like the taxonomy, and there's like more than 100 in there, and that isn't really the most engaging talk. So I'm not going to put you through all that. But if there's no more questions, then I'll just go straight on into the final part. Yeah, on that.
So you're talking about audits. So who's capable of doing those audits, and how can they evaluate this whole process? And are they sure that is it going to be the government, or is it going to be private sectors who are going to do the audits?
Yeah, good question. Pretty much all of the above. I guess it's like early days, definitely. And especially in the case of these like external audits, there is nowhere near like an established ecosystem of external auditors at the moment. And that's something that like has been a challenge with like, you know, when governments have like tried to press for having external audits be mandated in some form, a common reply from, you know, big tech and developers in the labs is like, well, who's going to do them? There aren't enough like qualified people out there, or like there's qualified people, but they haven't like set up these organizations to do the auditing. And in my opinion, that's a pretty fair reply. But, you know, we are seeing some of this. There's a few like nonprofits that have partnered with the labs to do like pre-deployment testing on a kind of voluntary basis. So there's Apollo, there's Meta. There's also the like government AI security institutes, although a lot of them have been like changing names lately, so I don't really know what to refer to them as, but like the one in the UK is doing a bunch at the moment where they have these, again, sort of voluntary agreements with companies to do these kinds of audits and evaluations. But they're not yet like embedded in like solid regulation at this stage. Exactly, yeah. And I think it is an interesting question of like, how do we build up this ecosystem, right? How can we incentivize people to do this kind of work? How do we incentivize labs to like have it be in their interest to have these kinds of external evaluations done on their models as well? Okay. So yeah, now I'm in this last part of this talk, essentially just going to be giving a long sort of like laundry list of like observations and advice, having worked in this space for a few years, to people that might be interested in getting into it. This is largely just going to be like off the top of my head. So if I've been rambling already, then apologies if it gets even more rambly. I guess like one pointer before I start though is that this is like kind of targeted towards technical people that want to start engaging more in policy stuff. So my first pointer is essentially, yeah, you want to build up like an awareness of what's going on in policy. And I think like the best way of doing that is literally just like reading what's out there and what people are putting forward in regulation. So go out and read the EU General Purpose AI Codes of Practice, read the draft California bill that's going through at the moment and is currently sitting on the governor's desk waiting for his approval. Read the AI action plan that was put out by the federal US government, and just get used to like reading that kind of language. It can be quite technical, quite weird in places. I remember I was looking at like a UN resolution a while ago that was maybe about 4 or 5 pages long. And the way that it was like structured was as a single sentence, where like each bullet point was like a clause in this sentence. And it's just like, why would you do that? But like, you know, if you want to read like the source material and know what's going on, you need to get used to that kind of like writing style. And then also here I've put like critique them. Something that's like really important is like, I guess, actively reading. So like for each point, it's like, okay, what do I think this is achieving? Do I think it achieves it well? What are the sort of like bottlenecks to like doing this? And like, yeah, putting yourself in the place of like, okay, if I were like offering feedback on this or like suggesting like improvements, what would I change about it? And that way you can kind of build up this muscle. Kind of like similar to the previous one, but I'd say you definitely want to start like building awareness of what's going on. So even if you're not like focusing on, you know, say you're only focusing on like what's going on in the EU, I'd say it definitely helps to like know what's going on in different jurisdictions, how they may like, you know, interact with each other at a global level, that sort of thing. But also like what different people and maybe communities think about what's going on in AI policy and what their views are. Thirdly, I'd say know what you want to achieve. So like know, kind of related to like what I was saying about critiquing, like have in mind what your sort of, what a good outcome would be in your mind. And sort of come at it from that level and try and like hone your own view of like what you would want policy to be focusing on. Now this is kind of relating to like, if you're working in this space and you start interacting with like policymakers or advisors and this sort of thing, I think it's fairly important to have cached takes or like views on things. Kind of, again, building on like knowing what you want to achieve. It's like a lot of the time a policymaker might come to you for like advice on something or like run something past you, and they're not going to wait around for you to like go off and do like a, you know, conference paper investigating this question on whether it's like good or bad to do X or Y. You ideally will have like thought about that sort of thing before, have an opinion on it already, so that you can like pretty quickly give some sort of answer. So this point, make it relevant and personalized. I guess this is more if you are like still doing technical research that you think policymakers might be interested in. I'd say definitely have like a fairly good idea of what that policymakers like priorities are and their jurisdiction as well. And essentially you should really try and like sell your work to them. Like, why should they care about what you're doing, right? Because I guess the way that policy ideas like get implemented is that they need to be like in line with the person you're talking to's interests and their boss's interests and their boss's interests. And eventually you sort of get all the way up to like, you know, ministers and like presidents and prime ministers and that sort of thing. And in order to make it up like every chain in that ladder, it needs to be like a recommendation that's like in line with their interests, right? So again, this is kind of like where awareness is going to like really help to sort of know what each of those people might want, right? And then you can make a case for why they should care about what you're working on. And finally, on this side, I do have another column on the other side with a few more points. I think one thing that I really noticed, having worked a bit in the UK government civil service, that was like really like a bit uncomfortable for me to get used to, coming from academia, is like a lot of the time you just have to give an answer, right? And in like research and academia, we're so used to being like, oh, more research is needed. It was like kind of inconclusive. Like, I'm not too confident in this conclusion. But in policy world, stuff needs to get done, right? And so even if you're like not fully confident in like an answer that you're giving your best guess is pretty much always better than like not giving an answer at all. And finally, just some like observations and like maybe challenges about like getting into this line of work. One is that like, unfortunately, it's all about like networking and who you know. Like the civil service is like fairly opaque from the outside, like really opaque. So it's not like in academia where it's like, if you want to reach out to a researcher halfway across the world that's doing something that you find exciting and relevant to what you're working on, you can just find their email and like get in touch with them. And like, you know, speaking from experience, people are pretty much always happy to talk. But if you have a policy idea, like where do you go? How do you know who the relevant person is? How do you get in touch with them? And I think, unfortunately, it's, you know, definitely the case that it's like you need to have some sort of personal connection to know who those people are and be put in touch with them. And so I think one of the important things, if you do want to kind of start working in AI policy or any sort of policy, is just like get to know people in a way. And then, you know, they can put you in touch with people that knows other people, because it is very much like word of mouth. And I think this is my last point, which is another observation I had working in UK government, is that like, you know, going in, I had this image of just like, okay, as a civil servant, you like sit at your desk and your boss gives you tasks to do and you do them, you like send off the like little memo that you wrote, and then like your boss does something with it, and you know, you turned the cog like a tiny amount. But actually, I was surprised at how much space there is for like, you know, going in as a junior person in the civil service. Like, if you have a good idea, you can like pitch it to your boss, and kind of like this thing of like making it relevant and personalized. If it's a good idea aligned with their interests, they can get on board and pitch it to their boss, and they can get on board, and suddenly you've got like stuff happening that kind of stemmed from your idea, right? So I don't think like you should feel constrained by like, you know, what's already happening and just feel like you have to like push in the same direction all the time. Nice. That's pretty much it. I've just got this recap slide of like my 2 core claims from earlier in the presentation, which I guess would be like the main takeaways about this area. So technical solutions are insufficient on their own, but also necessary for making like governance and policy go well. Nice. I'll leave it at that and say thank you so much for listening. There's the QR codes there for the papers I referenced. And yeah, happy to take more questions.
So what would you currently recommend as most important topics to work in right now, from the hundreds you listed in the papers?
I think, yeah, I won't say like a specific like research question at that level of like specificity. I think one thing that I am excited about, and I think a lot of other people are as well, is essentially just trying to get more transparency into the industry, right? I think like a while ago, a lot of the focus was on like, okay, we want to make labs act responsibly. And I think that's fine. Like it's a good goal to have in the long term. But I think in order to do that, you need to like firstly know what they're already doing. And so I think one big like challenge in the ecosystem at the moment is just like the public and also policy just don't know what's going on inside labs. And so, you know, I think that sort of means that we want to have more sort of transparency requirements, technical methods for like ensuring transparency, or like, you know, providing verification if transparency isn't possible, and stuff along these sorts of lines. And then as a side effect, you know, you may have this sort of like secondary effect of if labs have to make stuff transparent and act out in the open, maybe they would act more responsibly just because people are watching, right? So maybe you have your original goal met to some degree as well.
Hi, one comment is this area of governance, mine. So that's well established, thousands of articles. This is very new. So you're dealing with, so having the right answers, that's going to be a work in progress. And I'm thinking the kind, like, this hasn't been built. So that's where you got a lot of work for you. But anyway, I just saying if people are thinking, is there a right answer? Probably there shouldn't be because we're too early.
Yeah, no, definitely agree with that. And you know, I think that does mean that like, if what you're suggesting as an action or like solution is permanent and irreversible, that seems maybe not the best idea, right? Because how much confidence are you going to be able to have that that's going to be the best thing to do forever and like lock in stone?
What's called the strategic management process. It's a process of reviewing what's being decided upon, assessing and if there's a problem, then correction. So you have to build that process in, because a lot of companies say they have it, but they don't really do it. You don't want to accept their errors, which is another problem. But if you can get it working, it's very good. It's effective. So that allows for you to say, I think this could be wrong, but we need to check. We need to test it.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks.
Esther, okay. I just wanted to say maybe one of my biggest what makes me scared is some bad actors that will not comply with those type of governance and will act in the shadows and just do their things. And so have you thought about things that you can do or that we can do to prevent that?
Yeah. I guess, what kind of scale are you thinking here? Are you thinking like companies just like don't comply and like internalize any fine that you may place on them and they just like do it anyway? Or are you thinking, yeah.
I mean, I think that's, I didn't have that in mind, but I think if it can be inside the company itself, that's something that is worrisome, but maybe more on the larger scale, but it's too almost impossible, but still something that we should care about. So yeah, kind of thing that would not be easily detected or yeah.
Yeah. I agree. I think that is just like one of the main challenges, right? And you know, maybe it does, like a lot of people talk about like model weight security at the moment and these kinds of things where you try and like limit the people both internally and externally to labs that sort of have unrestricted access to AI systems and processes and that sort of thing, and try and like minimize the chances that like, you know, you have a bad actor on the inside that does something. Yeah, I think that's fairly important. Yeah.
I know you're talking earlier about there being a disconnect between policymakers and people who knew their things technically about watermarking. Are there any other things that, whether it's policymakers don't know what's going on, or whether it's people who are well versed on the technical side don't understand policy well, that are maybe proposed solutions that you hear floating around now and then that you don't think are as promising as people think they are?
I mean, the example I always would use is that one of watermarking, right? Which for me is like the clearest example. I guess like, yeah, kind of going the other way is that I feel like I see a lot of proposals from more technical people for like things that they would want to see in policy, which are like nowhere near being, at least in my opinion, nowhere near above the bar for like being politically feasible, right? You know, I guess one massive example is like the pause letter, like 2 and a bit years ago, where it's like proposing just like a global pause on like, you know, I think they phrased it in terms of like large training runs over like what was done at the time. And sure, maybe it's like a good meme to spread, but I think like the political feasibility of those kinds of ideas, both within like a single country, but also like globally, is just like, yeah, it's not going to happen, in my opinion. So.
So how much technical things do you in your daily life then do as a technical AI advisor? Or
Yeah, I think there's like different models for what you could do. Like I'd think of it as like a spectrum, right? And so like maybe at one end, what you do is like essentially looks like technical research. You do like experiments, you do a bunch of coding, this sort of thing. But the questions that you're trying to answer and like shed light on are like, you think, important for informing policy. So that's like one extreme where it's like, maybe what you do on a day-to-day basis isn't that different apart from like talking to a policymaker every once in a while. But then at the other end, it's like you could be essentially being a policymaker with a technical background and being the guy in the office that people come to with like, oh, like, does this make sense? You know, is this like how large models are trained at the moment? You know, can you explain like, I don't know, backpropagation to me or something? And sort of being that kind of resource. And so I guess me personally, I'm like somewhere in the middle, I guess, at the moment, where like I don't really code these days, but like, you know, staying up to date with like what's going on in technical research at the moment, and like being able to like read papers and understand them is a useful skill to have as well. Yeah. Any last questions? Cool. Thank you.